The hill rose cold and black against a January sky, its crest chewed down by shell fire until it looked like a broken tooth. Men climbed it in silence because breath made sound in the frozen air. Their hands were wrapped in rags against the wire. Their packs carried ladders, sandbags, and sections of plank to bridge the ditches. A flare lifted from the Russian lines and turned the world white. For a heartbeat, the hill showed every wound it had taken. Timber revetments blown open, trenches scooped like graves, the dark mouths of casemates. Then the flare guttered, and the hill went dark again except for the hard sparks of machine guns. The Japanese lieutenant at the front put his boot on the lowest rung of a ladder and went up. They called it 203-meter hill, a number that became an order. Take the height and you can see the harbor. See the harbor and you can finish the job. But the scene on that slope was only the last act of a siege that had begun 11 months earlier and had never once let up. What happened at Port Arthur in 1904 looked like the future. Trenches cut by template, belts of wire, attacks broken by machine gun cones, sappers working blind underground, howitzers levering shells the size of small trees, and men hammered until ground became a measurement for miles in bodies. The war opened at night before declarations were signed. On a cold February evening, black shapes crept toward the roadstead outside the Manchurian port the Russians called Port Arthur, and the Chinese knew as Lushan. Admiral Togo's destroyers loosed torpedoes into a fleet at anchor, then slipped away in confusion and smoke. Dawn showed damage, but not decision. The battleships were hurt, not sunk. But the message landed. Japan would strike first and then again until movement stopped or the enemy did. Inside the harbor, the Russians had numbers and heavy armor. They also had a narrow throat to the sea, a coastline of hard rock, and officers already arguing about whether to save the fleet or sit under the guns. When Admiral Stepan Makarov took command, he brought energy enough to change the atmosphere. He kept his ships near the mouth, took them out for short punches, and tried to keep the enemy guessing. Then in April, his flagship, Petropavlovsk, hit a Japanese mine and rolled under in less than 2 minutes. Makarov died with her. The shock closed the harbor without an order. After that, the Pacific Squadron rarely risked daylight. On land, General Nogi Moresuke's Third Army came down the Liaodong Peninsula with the method of a carpenter. He placed divisions like buttresses, cleared the side roads, and pressed the garrison back until Port Arthur sat inside a ring of hills and forts. The Russian commander, General Anatoly Stessel, had masonry, artillery, and a garrison that mixed stubborn regulars with sailors pulled from the bottled-up fleet. Between them lay ground carved into numbered forts and ridges. Erlung, Sungshu, and the works that guarded the heights like teeth around a mouth. At first, Nogi tried the old way, set an artillery preparation, put men in columns, and send them forward. In August, bayonets went up and the lines moved into a torrent of rifle and machine gun fire that shaved ranks level in seconds. They crossed ditches on the bodies of the men who fell first. Voices yelled for ladders that shattered like kindling when a shell landed among them. Reports read like ledgers of failure, only numbers and positions lost. A division could spend a day to gain a trench and give it back by dusk. By September, the siege had changed shape. The Japanese began to dig with a patience that frightened even their enemies. Saps ran forward at night, in angles like knocked knees, trenches linked by zigzags to shrink the field of shrapnel. Miners listened through sticks and earth for the thud of Russian counterminers. Underground fights ended with a shout and a flash that lifted timber roofs like lids. Above ground, sea-brought 28-centimeter howitzers set their feet on the hills and began to pound the forts with shells that landed like falling rooms. The Russians answered with heavy guns that threw back steel and heaved men from their cover as if the ground itself had changed its mind about holding them. Machine guns ruled the open. Barbed wire enforced geometry. When assaults came now, they moved close under the darkness, spread into swarms rather than files, and tried to make a path through iron without waking the whole line at once. Behind them, stretcher-bearers tracked by the sound of a voice that had shifted from command to pain. The hospital caves under the Japanese lines turned into rooms of steam and whispers. On the Russian side, sailors learned to run ammunition down steps slick with clay, while shells nailed the doors shut with splinters. Everything pointed to the same hill. From 203 meters summit, if a man could live long enough to lift his head, a spotter with a glass could find the silhouettes of battleships at anchor, like sleeping animals. Nogi threw brigade after brigade against it, and counted the ground in yards and names of regiments. The Russians counterattacked with troops who had learned every fold of the rock. It was hand grenades at the end, jam tins and iron bombs tossed over parapets in exchanges so close the two sides sometimes sat panting in the same crater between bursts, and then rose to kill again when the whistle came from either direction. When the Japanese finally secured the crest in December, it was not a hill any longer, but a shelf of shattered stone and frozen mud. They dragged a telephone wire up what remained of a path, set an observation post behind sandbags that could not stop a direct hit, and called fire. The 11-inch howitzers opened on the harbor with careful corrections. Below, the Russian ships took the first salvos with the dread of men in a room who suddenly hear the house above them being chopped to pieces. Hulls burned at anchor, masts sagged. The battleship Sevastopol alone steamed out of range, and then, when she could not be saved, was scuttled in deep water by her own crew, a grave chosen over capture. Inside the town, food ran thin. Civilians queued for millet and rumor. The garrison's hospitals held a catalog of the new century's wounds, faces stapled by wire, chest wounds that did not bleed outside, lungs scorched by fumes in the tunnels. Snow began to drift in the angles of shell holes and then turned pink at the edges. Stessel's officers argued over pride and arithmetic. Could the fort still stand a month, 2? Could the fleet be made to fight? Could any of that matter if the heights were gone and the artillery looked straight down their throats? The end came not with a shout, but with a note passed across lines under a white flag. On January 2nd, 1905, after 156 days of siege, the Russian command agreed to surrender the fortress, its guns, and its surviving garrison. Japanese officers walked the parapets they had bought yard by yard and found guns fused into lumps and parapets sheared off flat. They counted prisoners in thousands, and their own dead in numbers so large a man could not keep them whole in his head. Nogi, who had sent 3 sons to the army and lost one in the fighting, wrote to the emperor that victory had cost so much that the word felt thin against the weight. Reports afterward tried to turn the chaos into numbers. Days under bombardment, shells expended, forts taken, guns captured, prisoners marched to assembly grounds, ships sunk at their moorings. The numbers are true. They leave out what the men carried away as a lesson. At Port Arthur, both armies learned that trenches and wire could stop the bravest plan dead, that machine guns did the work of whole companies, that artillery, once married to a map and a telephone, could peel a position down to its bones. They learned that men could live for months under bombardment and still climb when ordered, and that victory could taste like swallowing a nail. The war moved on to Mukden and Tsushima, to treaties and humiliation and the political shock that followed in both empires. Port Arthur stayed behind as ground that explained what the next decade would become. Photographs taken after the surrender show a hill line that looks like a skull, empty eyes where casemates had been, jagged teeth where parapets stood. In some frames, men are smiling because they are alive. In others, they are just looking because there is nothing left to say. The harbor water is quiet. Beneath it lie plates and anchors, and the last work of crews who thought they had more time. Stand on that slope in winter, and the wind still finds the cuts where trenches ran. Pinch the dirt, and it is the same color as the photographs: ash, rust, snow. 100 small things invented here: the grenade tactics, the saps, the way you braid wire to catch a man at the knees, would scale up not long after. When people later called the First World War a new kind of horror, soldiers who had been on 203-meter hill already knew the outline. They had seen men vanish into earthworks and steel, and they had seen what it cost to pull them out. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.